Hey, Whiskey Ringers, more updates coming your way. First off, the Jack Daniels barrels are totally sold out. These went in about a week and a half at most. If you haven't received your bottle stickers, please reach out to me with your address and how many you got, and I'll be happy to get those to you as soon as possible. Next up, our current single barrel, the Podcaster Yak Attack, a Barrell Rye finished in Armagnac Casks, picked in partnership with This Is My Bourbon podcast, is live and available on my site. You can go to stores.mashnetworks.co, that's .co/WIMWR. That's WIMWR for Whiskey in My Wedding Ring. Patrons get first access to this one too, and got free shipping alongside it. The next barrel pick that's scheduled is a toasted oat whiskey from Spirits of French Lick, which should be available in about February and will also go through the same store. Also have a few picks rolling around right now that might pop up in the next few months. Best way to get first access, first knowledge of these things, special benefits, and codes for these bottles is to become a patron at www.patreon.com/whiskeyinmyweddingring. You can support for as little as $1 a month, with tiers at $5, $15, and $25. The $15 and $25 tiers also come with the opportunity to not only get samples from me, but the $25 tier lets you join me for barrel picks, whether they're in person or virtual. And with a lot of barrel picks hopefully coming down the line, this is the best time to sign up. There are just a few spots left at those top tiers, so if you're interested, don't miss out. Sign up now. Finally, I am thrilled to welcome Black Button Distilling out of Rochester, New York as my newest sponsor. They've just opened a beautiful new facility, and I got to visit, tour around, and do an on-site episode that'll come out later this month. Thank you all for listening. Thanks for supporting. Sign up on Patreon and rate and review wherever you can. Welcome, everyone, to a very special episode of the Whiskey Ring podcast. This one is on site in Rochester at Black Button Distilling. They have been on the podcast twice already now, once with Alex, once with Jason, and now we are back on site on their new location. So with that, I'm going to welcome on Jason Barrett, founder and master distiller, and
Gregg Stacy, director of marketing.
There we go. Apologies, I was going to forget your title right off the bat, so sorry for that.
It's quite all right. I'm called many things.
You started listing off different things you were doing. I was like, okay, it's director of marketing, but there's probably other things there.
Right.
I know how it goes. In small places, it's
all hands on deck.
All hands on deck,
Yep.
Exactly.
A world of many hats.
Yes.
Exactly. So, yeah, let's start off with the first thing, which is your new location. It's 6 times the size of the old one, 10 times the production. This is the 4th expansion in the history of Black Button, but the first off of your old location on Railroad Street. So let's just start off with the new facility. What does this open up for you?
It really opens up a lot of opportunities. We only moved about a mile from our original location, but we were very constrained in that space. We couldn't do private events. We had to stack pallets out in the parking lot. The equipment was shoved into the corners of the building, and we couldn't bring anything else in. So I mean, one of the biggest examples, we now have a high proof room that has 7 full road tanker sized tanks in it. So now when we get the cream in for our bourbon cream, we don't have to shut the whole facility down and use almost every tank we have and then make bourbon cream like crazy. We have a dedicated tank just to receive in that cream, can now make it into bourbon cream as we need, and continue operations as we go. Additionally, we went from a 1,500 gallon mash tun to a 6,000 gallon mash tun, and then from 4 sets of fermenters to 5, but eventually we'll be able to hold 10. So eventually we'll be able to make 40 barrels a day. So
it's impressive, just growth in general, and it made me think. I know when I first talked with Alex, this is going on about 2 years ago now. The bourbon cream was over 50% of sales. Is that kind of continuing at the moment, or is it shifted more towards the whiskeys and other
So the
spirits?
whiskey's been picking up a little more the last 2 years. Bourbon cream's still close to half, but a little under at this point. And as more whiskey keeps coming of age and getting older, we keep finding more and more folks that have interest in it. So, 2 years ago, the whiskey was probably just under 3 years. Now, the batches they're mixing up in the back are just over 4. And that extra 1 or 2 summers can make a big difference in what whiskey tastes like. So we've always put out stuff we were proud of, But one of the challenges when you make it all from scratch, and you're starting from scratch, is stuff has to come out so you can keep the economics working. And yet we've always tried to have each batch be a little older than the last, so that the whiskey keeps getting better and better. Plus, we figure we're getting a little better at making it as each year goes by. So those compounding things make for better and better whiskey.
Gotcha. And we'll get a little more into the new products and new expansions just a little bit later. But just jumping back to the location, in doing the research, I found that you guys had to get actual legislation passed in order to move the distillery.
Yeah, we had to pass a law. So turns out that you can start a distillery in New York just by getting approval from the state liquor authority, but to move a distillery requires an act of the legislature, which has only actually happened 7 times in the last 90 years. Luckily, they passed ours. It was just a little paragraph. Black Button's going to move from this address to that address, and it passed unanimously. But the New York Senate actually passes a full half of their laws in the last 24 hours of the year. And that was a little stressful, as I reminded our state senator that, tomorrow morning I'm either going to wake up and we'll have passed this law and Black Button will continue, or we're going out of business.
No, I saw that was part of the state liquor authority in 1933, so all that lovely post-prohibition legislation and such. But for listeners outside of New York, that is how the New York legislature works too.
So up until about 8 years ago, the New York State Liquor Authority's charge and motto was to promote temperance and good health in New York. It is now a much longer thing that has something to do with economic development and reasonable consumption, but it's never good when the people regulating you literally would prefer you didn't exist. So the State Liquor Authority has come a long way in the 11 years we've worked with them. And now they really are more of a partner to industry, but they still have these laws from 100 years ago, and they are bound to enforce them whether they agree with them or not.
And at what point when you were planning the move did you find out that you needed the legislation?
So we had known that for 4 or 5 years. So the move has been 3 years in planning. We looked at over 200 sites. We had a 19-point checklist. It was everything from zoning to fire district to the quality of the water in that water district, to how convenient was it for our employees, big enough for 18-wheelers, but convenient enough for a tasting room, preferably a low-rent district, which often the manufacturing places are, but a place that consumers would still be comfortable coming down to for the tasting room. So it was really quite the Venn diagram. And this space, I was checking every commercial real estate website every day. This space came up on a Wednesday at 7 p.m. I called on it Thursday at 11, got an appointment to see it Friday at 9, and by Friday at noon, we were in negotiations on the lease. So the landlord didn't have it up on the website for very long before we grabbed a hold of it. And it was the first space that had checked all 19 of our boxes, as well as it's just this beautiful old building. So the building was built for World War I. They made 75 millimeter howitzer shells here, pressed them out of brass blanks. Over 75% of the shells fired on the Western Front were pressed in this building before being sent to Rock Island Armory, be filled with gunpowder, sent to France, and ultimately fired at the Germans. One of them has actually made their way home. It's sitting on a shelf just above our bar. We managed to get it off of Etsy, of all things. But we tracked it down, looked at the markings once it arrived, and were able to confirm that it was pressed in this building.
And then I was hearing, so Alex has been touring me around, lovely tour of Rochester and also of the old and new facilities. And he was saying that in World War II, you also had some tank manufacture.
Yes, they made parts for Sherman tanks in this building during World War II.
So the building itself has pretty rich history. I mean, just a lot of exposed brick, always a beautiful site. So you get this feeling, and for listeners, obviously it's an audio podcast, but I'll include for listeners, it's an Auto podcast, but I'll include photos and such of the story. And you get the sense it's, of course, industrial because we're in an industrial zone and you're doing industrial activities, but there is a hominess about it that you get with the brick walls. Looking up, I just noticed this, the barrel walls on the ceiling, which I love.
Yep.
And it's little, touches that make it seem like, okay, this is wood, brick, steel, copper, all working together.
And a lot of that was done with a lot of intention and then also sometimes getting a little lucky. So you see these giant wooden beams. Our original place had big wooden beams. And so we knew that was a design element we wanted to bring in. But in order for beams that large to dry, we needed to cut them about 3 years ago. So we contracted with a Mennonite farmer not far from my farm, brought these beams down, cut them to size, and then put them in a warehouse to dry before we even had this site considered. And we luckily, we cut a few extra and we made them a little longer. And then when the site came together, we were able to fit them into it. But it was just a necessity in order to make it all work. But some of it took a little bit of a leap of faith of, I believe we will pass the law. I believe we will find a space and I will believe we use it. Or I guess if not, we'll own 25 really big beams.
So in addition to the building's history, you've also got a larger history in this district. So Culver University East, also known as Q, apparently. And just doing a little bit of reading, I wanted to let you guys tell the story of that, but it's a very strong cultural and historic presence within Rochester. So with moving into the space, I understand it was a very quick move in terms of finding the space, choosing it, and signing it, but at the same time, there is that cultural and historical milieu that you're entering into. So how do you see Black Button fitting into that as you continue to grow into this space?
Yeah, so this neighborhood's always, at least for my whole life, has always been sort of where the young professionals in Rochester want to live. There's a lot of older, McMansions that have been cut up and turned into apartments, so they've got a lot of history and a lot of character to them. It's a very walkable neighborhood. You've got a lot of small shops and a lot of independent restaurants. And then the road we're on, University Avenue, really in the last 5 years, has really become a bit of a nightlife destination. Rochester's one urban winery is just down the street. We've got several breweries, several cocktail bars. We're about to have a bakery move in next to us. There's a lot of tech companies starting to put their offices down here. So, it's a very lively part of Rochester and very accessible to the Rochester highway system. So those in the suburbs are able to get right down to it very quickly. And overall, we just think it's a great, a great spot to live and work and enjoy a cocktail.
And in terms of, just to finish off on the new location, with such a huge jump in production capacity at every step of the process, right now, I think you have up to 14,000, if you wanted to grow to that, up to 14,000 barrels per year.
Yep.
But doing about 4,000 now and then continuing to grow into that. Between the, let's say, 4,000 that you're doing for in-house production plus what you may do for contract, is there enough supply and demand right now to fill that capacity, or is that still something that you want to build up and fill over time?
So, we're happy to make it as fast as the customers come. We're in negotiations with several good-sized brands that need more capacity but aren't in a place to build out their own facility currently. And whether they're based in New York City or based, mostly throughout New England, we like to make whiskey. So if they're ready, we're ready. And I think, although 4,000 and 14,000 barrels is a lot for craft spirits, it's worth pointing out that the new Heaven Hill facility makes 4,000 barrels a day. Each of the two Jim Beam facilities make 3,000 barrels a day. So in the grand scheme of whiskey, if the industry stops growing, which it probably won't, and we max out our capacity at 14,000 barrels, we will make 1 out of every 10,000 barrels of bourbon in America. And that is both an interestingly large and interestingly small number at the same time.
Sure.
So we aren't, probably going to be making your Jack Daniels and your Jim Beam, but there are other craft producers or craft adjacent producers that have more need that we think we can make really high quality whiskey for, and as long as the numbers work, we're excited to do it.
And I think as of now, New York has the greatest number of distilleries of any state.
Yeah, we're certainly right up there with the West Coast. California, Washington also have about 200. So I think, we'd have to check on any given day, but
Sure.
we're right up there in the top 3. And if you figure there's only about 2,000 craft distilleries in the nation, if there's 200 in New York, that means 1 out of every 10 distilleries in the country is in New York State.
Sure. And, within the 200 or so that are in the state, with this new capacity and the new production level, where does that place you?
Certainly the largest privately owned one. There's a couple that are down in the Hudson Valley that are now part of multinationals. And there's something about Wall Street money that really does seem to accelerate the growth of these things. But yeah, I'd say we're probably making 20 to 30% of the whiskey in New York right at this facility.
Which is in itself a hell of a statement.
Yeah.
So with the growth, of course, has come new products, both currently and in the future. Jason, you were quoted in Rock City Mag over the summer saying, you've already distilled whatever you're going to distill and produce you've already distilled whatever you're going to release in the 2020s. And then whatever's going into the barrel now is for the 2030s.
Pretty much.
So at this point, that basically means you're committed to around, let's say, a 7 to 8 year age statement at, growing from the age you are now with the whiskey to 7 to 8 years. That's a pretty bold statement to make.
Yeah, that was always the long-term goal, was to get the whiskey into that 7-8 year range. For our climate up here in New York, I think that's sort of the sweet spot. There's this misnomer that whiskey keeps getting better forever. And, certainly when you've got 20-year-old Scotch, you would think, then 20-year-old bourbon must be delicious. I think if you sent a cask of bourbon to Scotland after 20 years, it might be great. But we get a lot of temperature fluctuations here and very cold, very dry winters, which cause a lot of evaporative loss. So our 7-year-old whiskey should drink like a Kentucky 12. And that's always been, again, kind of a sweet spot for me in terms of balance with wood, with grain character, with the yeast. I just don't want an oak bomb or something that's out of balance. So that's always been what we've been shooting for, and we think we've laid enough whiskey away that we'll be able to do that. To some degree, I joke that whiskey is a self-correcting product, because if people don't like it at that age, they don't buy it, so you don't have to bottle as much, so it keeps getting older. So if you keep the price the same, in general, it will all work itself out in time. And so right now, our whiskey in 30-gallon barrels is right about 4 years. That's going to be roughly equivalent to a 53-gallon barrel that's at 6 years. But at this point, we're almost exclusively filling 53-gallon barrels. We do some specialty projects or R&D things in 30s, partly so that we can shorten the cycle of R&D to learn what works and what doesn't.
And with these new products, I want to hit on a couple of them. The first one being you got an upcoming release of the first in market barrel strength Empire Rye. So I think, Greg, we're going to throw that one to you to introduce it to us.
Sure. Well, we've been making our Empire Straight Rye whiskey for a while, one of the founding distilleries in the Empire Rye Association. So we've been very proud of that rye. One of the things we're looking at as we've been playing with a couple of different releases is extending a little bit on the rye side of things. We love our rye, and we thought a natural extension would be a barrel strength version of that. So we have a very limited release that's coming out during Empire Rye Week this year. We'll release it on the 18th of October, and we're going to have a special event here. One of the things that you can probably see from the size of the space, we have a lot of opportunity for events. Mm-hmm. So as we're really getting our feet under us for operating events, we're going to have this as being really a first full release with a new product. The Ballast brothers, who have made a documentary about rye in New York State called Fire, Water, and Grain, the story of Empire Rye, they'll be here. They'll actually be screening this video. They're kind of going around the state to various distilleries and doing that.
Awesome.
We're going to have a rye flour ravioli made by a local pasta shop in town. And we have our own vodka cream sauce with a few local partners that will actually be part of that as well. So a lot of fun. We like to make a little bit of a deal out of some of our new releases and make it an event so that people aren't just coming and just sampling and then buying a bottle and go, but get a chance to experience the whole movement.
No, it's smart.
So,
it's a way to, like you said, bring people in, but also have them remember it.
Yeah. And the rye, the barrel strength rye itself is great. This is actually a prototype, but the first samples that we've had have been outstanding. So we're looking forward to releasing it.
Awesome. And just to take a step backwards, let's just remind listeners what Empire Rye requires.
Well, I don't know, Jason, you could probably talk to the volume. I know as far as our mash bill, we have 94% Danko rye grown locally in the mash bill, and then 6% malted barley. So it's very, very rye heavy. You get that flavor profile, a little bit peppery. It's one of my favorites out of all of the whiskeys, but that's really part of the profile and the mission of the Rye Association is to really work on New York State grown rye and really promote that out. A lot of states have their claim to fame that we were the rye state. We started it, we own it. We like to think that New York State is, and I think that's part of the Rye Association and our mission to really get that message out there.
I mean, if you go back to before Prohibition, really throughout most of human history, alcohol was always a luxury. It wasn't what sustained you, but it certainly made life better. And so you often were trying to make alcohol out of something very cheap, partly because if it was something more valuable, you tended to turn it into a food product because people didn't want to starve. So rye is an interesting grain in that it will grow almost anywhere. Rocky ground, loamy soil, too wet, too dry. It is a hardy crop. And so farmers could end up growing it in land that was really not suitable for wheat or for corn that they might feed to their animals. And it was very common, back in the agricultural society heyday, to spend most of the winter in the barn with a small still, converting this crop into whiskey and then taking it to the town and turning it into a saleable product. Imagine you live on the wrong side of a mountain and you need to walk 2 weeks to get to the big town where you need to buy a plow or need to buy whatever you need for your farm. You can either try to haul 2,000 pounds of grain or 2 barrels of whiskey. Well, it's a lot easier to put a barrel on each side of a mule and walk that path than whatever that giant sack of grain would look like. And time was something farmers had quite a bit of in the winter because there wasn't any other crops to work on. So even a 10-gallon still could keep somebody pretty busy, and you could make this money. The Ryes in New York, being a more northerly climate, tended to be a little plumper, a little softer. Danko rye was a more common style. We had access to more advanced distilling equipment coming up the Erie Canal, whereas if you go down into Maryland and Pennsylvania, which also have their own rye traditions, you tended to have ryes that were a little thinner, longer, grassier, bitier. So they just had their own styles. So the Empire Rye Association was formed about 6 years ago by 8 distillers who all were making rye, and it all looked into that history. It has to be 100% New York grain. At least 75% of that grain has to be rye. Has to come off the still at under 160 proof, go into a barrel at no more than 115 proof, and be aged a minimum of 2 years. And so the idea behind these standards was to leave a lot of flexibility because there's a wide variety of how people do their ryes, but also enforce some quality standards that would just make for a higher quality product. So, the historic proof that whiskey was entered into a barrel at was between 100 and 110. It was moved to 125 to save wood during World War II. It also made it cheaper to make whiskey, so many distilleries stayed with that as the legal limit. There's lots of distilleries that go in at 124.9. At Black Button, we've always taken a more quality-focused approach. So we were excited because a lot of these rules that what we had already made was already in compliance, but we were just one of 8 voices in setting those rules. So yeah, now at this point, I think there's over 25 folks across the state making Empire Rye, and we just see it as a growing category that continues to show off both the history and the present of what is possible in New York State with whiskey.
We have a lot of fun just educating people about rye too, because I think with bourbon as being in such the focal point right now in whiskeys, rye seems to be a little bit more of one of the misunderstood or even unknown whiskeys. And a lot of people who are a little bit novice to the category will just assume rye bread, and that's not what you're getting out of a rye. I mean, that's the pumpernickel in a bread, and what we'll get is you're not going to get the sweetness that you do out of bourbon without the corn, but we look at the black pepper spice and tones of toasted nuts more than anything, and I think it's a great sipper on its own as well as in a cocktail. But it's really fun to sample people on rye because they don't really know what to expect, or they have a different expectation. So this event is going to be fun. I think a lot of people are going to learn a lot about rye that they didn't know.
And especially the opportunity to try it in other products simultaneously is a lot of fun.
Yeah. Yep.
And as we're pointing out, I mean, within the Empire Rye designation, there's that room, whatever the other 25% of the grain, as long as it's from New York State, it can be anything. You, at Black Button, use only rye and malted barley. Others, of course, do include corn in their mash bill, and then Greg, as you're pointing out, that's going to add a little sweetness to it, a little different flavor, whereas yours is more on the peppery side, what I would consider my preferred style of rye, I think.
We figured if you're going to drink rye whiskey, it should be a big, bold,
right,
kind of smack you in the face rye whiskey.
And 94% will do that.
Yes.
Yep.
And also, as you were pointing out, I wanted to ask this, 2 questions, actually. The first one being, you're saying you're using Danko rye. Mm-hmm. To your knowledge, was this the rye that's been used long-term?
So there were hundreds of farmers and hundreds of distillers around the Rochester area prior to Prohibition. We certainly know that some of them used Danko rye because they were bringing it to the flour mills on Brown's Race on the Genesee River to have it milled. But it's hard to know whether it was predominant. Yeah, but certainly some of them were using that. Most grains, when they were entered in, were just entered in as wheat or small grain or rye. They weren't, in the 1850s, they were less worried about genetic varietals than we are today. And there are numerous other heritage styles that some of the other folks use. We just found that Danko grows really well here in the Genesee Valley, and has some historic ties. So that's why we decided to go all in on that. Plus, it makes for a really big, fat, juicy kernel.
And I'm coming off from this interview, just coming off of an interview with Laura Fields from the Delaware Valley Fields Foundation and Bob McDonald from Dancing Star Farms, both very strongly into the rye movement, more focused on Rosen, of course, and Keystone Rosen, but still promoting rye as an alternative to bourbon and a spirit deserving of its own place in the spotlight. And, going off of that, right now you're getting your grains all from still one farm. Mm-hmm. And it was a question that I posed to Bob in the interview about how much they could grow. Because at a certain point, you just have that many acres, and maybe you can increase the yield a little bit, but you still limit on the acres. So to tie it back to production, do you think in this facility, for your production limits that you have, will you still be able to focus just on sourcing from that one farm?
Yeah, so we actually use just under 100 acres to grow what we're growing. When we started, the farm was about 1,000 acres. They're now at 2,600 acres. So in some ways, they're growing a little faster than, anyway, they're growing fast enough, let's put it that way. So even though next year we will probably be putting in close to 500 acres as we get ready for everything, we're not even actually their top customer. Interestingly enough, they specialize in growing this little black bean that apparently is a delicacy in Okinawa. And so they ship, their main crop is shipping these specialty black beans over to southern Japan. And then they grow a lot of corn for their beef cattle, and then they grow a lot of our stuff. But yeah, at the moment, our farmer, we have talked about this, and he has joked that as long as I can give him good projections, he is happy to go keep acquiring more land to get ready. And, in a small farming town, a lot of these are generational businesses. They're sixth and seventh generation. They still run the farm out of the original homestead, but a lot of times as other smaller farmers don't go to that next generation, they have an opportunity to add to their farming legacy, and they're already working on the eighth generation. So I think they're going to be farming in the Genesee Valley for a long time. It's the plan anyway.
We like to have some of these new products be very limited as well. So really the barrel strength is going to be released here only in the tasting room and only 100 bottles. So we've had a lot of these limited releases sell out before the events even happen. So it keeps people coming back for more and looking for more, but it's also certainly not going to exhaust any supply of rye.
Awesome. I mean, the business side of things, you guys clearly have figured out sorry, let me rephrase that. That was terrible.
As I say, we must be faking it pretty well.
Working on it.
Right, so I'll rephrase that. So from an outside observer who's obviously not in the industry, but has seen a lot of distilleries and producers across the board, it seems like you have the plans in place that you can have in place. Jason, as you said, it's a self-correcting industry to a certain point. Like if you have a bad harvest one year, you got to fix or figure out where you're going to get the grain from. Maybe, knock on wood, nothing bad happens. There's no accidents or anything. But with whiskey, with a multi-year product like this, there's always an element of the unknown that comes up.
And we're actually facing one of those next year. As we know, the whiskey is 4 years old, so 2024's whiskey should have been made in 2020. Something was happening in the world back then. I try not to recall. But not only were we making hundreds of thousands of bottles of hand sanitizer for the local hospital systems, but the world was a very precarious place. And so it was not, it was hard to take a risk back then of putting whiskey down, hoping that 4 years later you're going to need it. So we made very, very little whiskey in 2020. And by 2021, we had gotten back into making a bunch of it. But there really is this gap in the whiskey library that covers a good 6 months of 2024. And so we've had to be very careful and strategic about how we use whiskey in 2023 and what that will mean for the whiskey over these next 18 months. We actually withdrew from several states this year, getting ready for this dearth. So there will certainly be enough whiskey for the tasting room, and we believe to keep all of our New York shops in good places. But we actually it was just earlier this week that we determined how much was going to go to each of our distributors outside New York, and that's all they're going to get. And the irony is that by limiting how much they can have and therefore making the product in more demand, it seems to have actually caused the sales to go up in those areas, which was actually not the intention. If I had just known that withholding it from people would lead to sales, I would have withheld it a long time ago. Right. But yeah, it is a variable product. We've had years where we haven't been able to make as much rye as we wanted because the rye crop didn't come in the way we did. Luckily, at only 9% rye in the bourbon, and we prioritized that, we were able to make lots of bourbon. And the bourbon, because our farm has beef cattle, they grow a lot of corn. Mm-hmm. So therefore, we're usually, and they can also substitute feed their beef cattle depending on how the harvest. So that one is less of an issue. But yeah, we plant about twice as much rye as we think we're going to need, with the hope that half of it comes out the way we want it to. And most years it does, but not always. And it even comes down to where on the farm do you plant it. Again, 2,600 acres, and it's not continuous. It's spread out over most of southern Livingston County. We try to separate those rye fields so that if something happens, over here, over there, each of these fields has its own microclimate. Right. The ones that are closer to the lake, Canisius Lake, are more temperate. The ones that are up on the sides of hills are better drained. The ones on the west side of the hill have more wind. All of these end up impacting the crops. And so we've had a very dry summer here in western New York. My farm in Bristol has actually been almost drought conditions for most of the summer. And yet our 25 minutes away, our main farm that grows most of our grains, they've had a very temperate year. And the way the rain has just moved south of some of the Bristol hills has watered their fields quite nicely. And yet they've got friends 15 minutes away that will get 20% of their crop out this year.
I mean, it's a little more than 15, 20 minutes away, but it sounds like we need to send some of the storms we've had in the city recently more north and west up to you guys.
I mean, the trouble with water is that you need the total amount of water that my farm has had this year has been right on par. The problem is we've gotten almost all of it in 3 days, which caused flash floods. Mm-hmm. And so there's nothing like having too much water and not enough water simultaneously.
Right. Yeah, we've had, I was going to say, this is just after all those floods and rains from Ophelia. And we can probably throw some away from the Hudson Valley, away from the city, and just push it north. It'll get to us eventually just down the rivers, but, push a little west for now.
Right, spread it out.
Spread it out. So I'm going to jump ahead actually here to a different line of question that I had that dovetails with what you were just saying and into the business side a little more, which is, as you said, looking ahead to 2024, you had to pull back in certain markets and limit the stock, which, as you said, it's going well. So, you can't knock it in that way. It'll keep interest going. But it does reflect a mindset and methodology that you've focused on throughout Black Button's history, which is owning your backyard and owning New York, really focusing on New York as the primary market. And the way that I'm hearing it is that when you were looking ahead and you see in 2024 you're going to have this dearth of available whiskey that is of the age and quality that you want to put out in bottles, you could have gone two ways. You could have gone the way you did, which was to pull back in the external markets and focus more on New York, or at least make sure that New York was fully stocked and then deal with external, or to continue stocking the external and growing, pull back a little bit on New York and, go in that direction. What has led you to kind of continue investing in owning New York and focusing on our home state?
I think it's a variety of factors. One, it's just where we found the most success. So, if I was ever to give someone business advice, it is simply pay attention to what is successful and do more of that. We make New York whiskey, and that resonates with New Yorkers better. We do well in New Jersey. We do well in Massachusetts. We didn't do poorly in Texas, but they now have great whiskey being made in Texas. And so rather than going to Texas and trying to compete with Texas whiskey and Colorado whiskey and Florida whiskey, New York is our backyard. I think it also helps that in New York, we have a very strong culture of independent liquor stores, and that, we're a very independent brand. So being able to make a deal with each individual liquor store owner of how these products will enhance their shop and how they will help grow that business and working together with them works really well for us. Honestly, we don't do as well in those big box stores where it just ends up on a shelf, one of 1,000. The staff isn't as knowledgeable or isn't as available to give recommendations. We really do well in the stores that are manned by the family that owns them and are able to tell our story and talk to people about why this is special and why you should pay $50 for a bottle of handcrafted, locally made whiskey when you can get a big Kentucky bourbon for $35. and many people are going to drink both, and that's okay, but you need that advocate, and we've just found that advocacy is stronger here in New York. We actually still believe that we have the ability to 5x the company just in New York State. We actually don't have any sales reps in the Hudson Valley currently. We'll be adding one next year. We're only in about 6% of liquor stores in New York City, so lots of growth there. And Long Island has continued to grow by leaps and bounds for us, where we actually doubled our sales force there this year. So, there's still lots of opportunities to grow, and that's where investing in the new plant became a necessity if we're going to achieve these growth goals in New York and beyond, but especially in New York. We needed more whiskey.
It's also a lot of this is the distribution game too. We're self-distributed mostly in New York State, so we're in control of our own destiny. And when you're moving outside of state, going broader geography, you're working with wholesalers. They have a lot of brands in their house, so you're competing with that share of mind with the wholesaler to sell into stores. We can do that even in areas that we're further away from Rochester because we can tell the story. It's tougher to get that story to translate down when you're working through wholesaler sales reps and they're selling a big book and they have a lot of different brands. And then, the farther away you get from home, there's a lot of us in other markets. There's a lot of craft distilleries around, so we're competing with that share of mind. We're very, very proud of the New York story, so we can tell that, and it resonates a lot stronger in New York State than it does in a state that's outside. We have other ways that we position ourselves on quality, but that New York state of mind doesn't necessarily resonate in Texas.
Sure.
It's also been interesting, the rise of direct-to-consumer shipping. You now have the opportunity for those folks that either do read about us in a magazine or listen to this podcast. If they want to get the product, they can now have it shipped to them. And if you figure, if there's 2,000 craft distilleries and they on average make 10 products, that would mean to cover craft, not even imports, wine, or the big guys, a store would have to stock 20,000 SKUs. And most liquor stores don't. That's just not realistic. And so therefore they have to be choosy. And they're not saying that this whiskey is any better or worse than one made up the road, but again, there's often a strong preference for local.
So it's no secret on this podcast, I like to push New York distilleries and producers when I can, because I'm very proud of my home state, just as you two are. And Greg, actually I should ask, are you from New York also?
I am.
Okay.
Yep.
All right, good. We got a full team here. So sorry, Alex.
We've adopted him. I don't know what it is about Ohio that makes people flee the planet. They have more astronauts than anywhere. But he made the right choice. And your wife's from New York too, right? Yeah. So see, he married a New York girl. He lives in New York. He made all the right choices in life.
I feel like, and you, Alex, you can come over for this if you want to, respond to the accusations. But I feel like that tidbit about Ohio making people want to leave the planet, it's got more astronauts than everywhere else, that is not the first time he's used that, is it?
No, I think that's at least 3 times a quarter.
Okay.
Probably we get that one.
I mean, for what it's worth, it's my only joke about Ohio. So I just keep going back to it.
Most jokes I get are just about corn and how that's like my favorite thing, but I don't know why that's the only thing most people can think of.
I mean, it is one of your favorite things just when it's been distilled into bourbon, right?
100%.
There you
go. Sorry, thank you, Alex. I figured I would give you a chance to respond to that, because you deserve a chance to respond.
Anytime there's more acquisitions, I'll be right over here, don't worry.
You got it. For listeners, you may remember, Alex was actually the first Black Button guest in, I believe, episode 36, something around there. So a while back, in the early days of the podcast still. So thrilled to have him hosting us. So this year, this is about 3 weeks after I've come back from the Kentucky Bourbon Festival. Also went through Tennessee there, and I love visiting down there to see the distilleries, the big guys, and the craft guys. But let's say hypothetically I go back to the Kentucky Bourbon Fest next year, and not only am I trying what's there, but I'm also talking to people about, hey, you should pay attention to New York whiskey, both Black Button and other brands that we love and want to support. What's the sales pitch or the elevator pitch for why people need to pay more attention to New York whiskey? This month's Impact Spotlight is on a new whiskey from Adelphi, McLean's Nose. a new blended Scotch whiskey expertly crafted to have a West Coast character with both a high malt content at 70% and a high proportion of ex-sherry casks. Maclean's Nose is both a nod to Ardnamurchan's rugged Western Peninsula home with its beautiful landmark on the south coast of the peninsula, and as an homage to the long mentorship they've received from Mr. Charles Maclean. Maclean is an undisputed legend, affectionately referred to as the Chief Nose, since 1993 when the Adelphi name was revived as an independent bottler by Jamie Walker. Bottled at a super approachable 46% ABV, this is the perfect dram to sip while reading one of Charlie's acclaimed books. At an even more approachable $35 a bottle, this is a must-buy, especially for those of us who, much as we must love bourbon, are going to be fully bourboned out by the end of this month. Join me in the dram and look for Maclean's Nose in your favorite whiskey shop near you. The Whiskey Ring podcast is proudly sponsored by Impex Beverages.
I mean, to me, it's what makes life interesting is the variety. You know, I don't want to eat the same thing for dinner every night. I don't want to go to the same restaurant every night. We're not trying to make Kentucky bourbon. We're trying to make New York bourbon. And to us, that's a little softer, a little sweeter, a little easier on the palate, mixes well in a cocktail. Not that Kentucky bourbon doesn't, but we've got different grains, different equipment. So if you love bourbon, why wouldn't you try New York bourbon, Texas bourbon, Washington bourbon? And I think folks don't realize how agriculturally rich New York is. When you say New York to most of the rest of the country, I think they think Manhattan.
Yep.
And while there's plenty of whiskey being made in Brooklyn, they're growing the grains upstate. The Genesee Valley was carved out by the glaciers a millennia ago. The topsoil is 400 feet thick. We have some of the clearest, cleanest water in the country, and we have a very variable climate. These are the things you need to make great whiskey. So you add that to passion and people paying a lot of attention. New Yorkers are known for being a little fastidious.
Just a little bit, yeah.
And all of a sudden, there's no reason you can't make great whiskey. And that's also not to take anything away from the great whiskey they make in Kentucky. I have great friends at many of these distilleries. There is like nothing cooler to me than when I get to hang out with Nicole Austin at Cascade Hollow or Craig Beam, formerly of Heaven Hill, now down at Jackson Purchase, and pick these guys' brains about airflow through a whiskey warehouse, because there aren't that many people that geek out about that like us and them. And what I think most people don't realize is when it comes to quality, when it comes to safety, this is an incredibly collaborative industry. Everybody wants every other producer to make better whiskey in a safer way. Sure, if we're competing at a cocktail menu, do I want them to pick our bourbon? Of course we do. But, until you've tried it or tried a bunch of them, I think people should open up their minds. I mean, there's thousands of wineries around the country. There's thousands of breweries. And now there are 2,000 distilleries. And you've got everything from guys like us making 40 barrels a day with 147 employees to a friend of mine in Colorado who uses about 1 pallet of glass a year. We go through 3 pallets an hour. And there's nothing wrong with any of that. Her and her husband make great products. You can only get them in their little ski town. It's a part of their community and a part of that destination. And, if you're in Crested Butte, look at the distilleries that are in that town. And if you want to try new and exciting things you can only get there, do it. But to me, when I travel, I don't want to eat at Applebee's. I don't want to eat at TGI Fridays. I want to go for what that place is known for. I was at a convention in St. Louis, and they do fried ravioli.
That's a big thing down there.
Deep fried ravioli. I liked it. I don't know that I'd eat it every day. I feel my life is richer having eaten it. So I drove 20 minutes outside into this podunk town of downtown, took an Uber way out to the middle of nowhere. According to Yelp, this place had the best deep fried ravioli in St. Louis. And that's a memory I'll keep with me for a long time. And to me, whiskey, especially whiskey with that sense of place, can do the same thing for people.
Maybe we'll deep fry some of the ravioli for our event for you, just for memory.
There we go.
I was thinking that. Yeah, you beat me to it.
Yeah, no, I think, certainly variety and genuine quality. And I think one of the things that we have a lot of work to do in educating people about New York. I think, Kentucky has been known for bourbon forever. And I think there's a perception, and sometimes we'll have friendly arguments with people even on social media, that you can't make bourbon if it's not made in Kentucky, which isn't true. And, it's just getting people to understand that real great bourbon is being made up here. And some of that's the sampling opportunities, and just keep tooting our horn and telling people we're making great stuff.
And, I mean, from what both of you were saying, I completely agree. And I think to put into context of rye in particular, Jason, you said it best earlier. Rye grows everywhere.
Yeah.
It grows in Texas. It grows in Colorado. It grows in New York. Corn may be a little bit more difficult depending on the season and conditions, but rye is just basically, if there's good enough soil somewhere, it'll grow. And
I don't even know that it requires the soil. I've
That's
seen
true,
it
yeah.
grow up in sidewalk cracks.
yeah, that's true.
But I mean, also, I think people don't pay enough attention to the weather. I mean, it truly, and someday I hope to do this. So, maybe you've heard it here first. I would love nothing more than to make 40 barrels in a day here in Rochester, split them up into 20 sets of 2, keep 2 here and ship a set of 2 to 19 different friends of mine across the country. And I've already had about 10 people that agreed they would house these barrels. And then at the end of 4 years, ship them all back and bottle them. Because I can tell you that the idea is controlling for every variable that we could, except for the weather. But the barrels that go to Denver, and the barrels that go to Houston, and the barrels that go to Portland, whether that's Maine or Oregon, are going to taste distinctly different than the barrels that are aged here in Rochester, even though they were all made the exact same day, put in the exact same barrels, from the exact same fermenter. That warehousing and weather is going to dramatically change them, as well as just the trip across the country, all that rattling around on the trucks. So I think there's also just that different parts of this country, the stuff, you can't get bagels like Brooklyn anywhere except Brooklyn. And that's really due to the water. But it's also due to just the history and the competition. Because you can't have a subpar bagel in Brooklyn, you'd go out of business. You can't have subpar barbecue down in Texas because you'd go out of business. And now with 200 distilleries, we're starting to prove that if you're going to make whiskey in New York, it better be good, because otherwise the rest of us are going to kick your ass.
That's as good of a sales pitch internally as it is externally.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, if you look at, is the distilling segment is catching up with craft beer. Craft brewing really got into the whole geographic terroir discussion. Now, and there's East Coast, West Coast IPAs, New England IPAs, all these segmentations. And, for a long time, a lot of the smaller craft breweries were really talking about their local grains, their local water. And they've nailed that down pretty well. And now we're taking that cue, and it does matter. I mean, we're not just selling it because it's a marketing line. It's true. And
just to circle back, the what I meant to say with rye growing everywhere is that you're going to get a different profile of rye beyond just the type of rye. Danko, right. Rosen, any Wheeler, any other type of rye. If you had the same Danko growing in 50 different states, you'd get 50 different styles of rye that come off of the stalk, and then 50 different styles that come off the still.
Right.
And I think it should be worth and interesting to try as many as you can.
Yeah.
And jumping in with New York being so heavily, or with the potential to be so heavily a rye focus on the state, because I don't know what the balance is between total production in the state between bourbon, rye, other whiskeys, but
I would imagine bourbon is still the lion's share of it.
Probably, yeah.
It is the lion's share of the industry. So.
Right.
Actually, I would imagine the number one thing made in the state is gin.
Probably, yeah.
Partly just that you can make gin in a few weeks. Bourbon's got to be laid down for years. It's a lot harder of a capital investment turn to run a whiskey distillery.
Right.
I think water is one of those big things too. Jason touched on the checklist of this location, and our Finger Lakes water is a huge variable, and that's something that that is terroir. And one of the things that Jason was talking about, the checklist in this building, is that this allowed us to stay on the same water system that we were in the previous location. So moving out to another water district could have varied our flavor profile. So this keeps would have.
I mean, truly, you move this plant 10 miles north, and you're going to go from the Hemlock Lake Water District to the Lake Ontario Water District. The micronutrients is totally different, and we even did some test runs with it, and it would not have been a move in a good direction for us.
So jumping back to the business side again, too, because honestly, we don't talk about the business side very often on this podcast, and I want to talk a little bit more because it's really important to understand that this is a business and requires a lot of investment and time to make it successful. Just to throw a couple numbers out there, I mean, you're among the 5,000, you're on the list, I should say, of the 5,000 fastest growing privately owned businesses in the U.S. You're actually in the top 650 of that group, so really almost in the top 10%, I think top 12%. 900% growth in the past 3 years. In addition to those numbers, the tangible assets, the new space, more barrel warehousing, from your looking forward to your next couple of years, what does this mean for the brand, for Black Button and beyond?
I mean, it's been a real challenge. We've luckily got a very passionate team that works very, very hard, and I think also is very decisive, is one of the reasons why we're able to move as quickly as we are. I think it's important to note that we make vodka, we make gin, we make other things that can be turned in a couple weeks, because otherwise the growth of whiskey does become sort of a cash flow monster that can eat you alive. You've got to take all your profits from this year and reinvest them into whiskey 4 or 5 years from now at a pretty prodigious rate. There were not a lot of other distilleries on that list. There are not a lot of manufacturing companies on that list, and certainly manufacturing companies that, again, have to make product years in advance. So, I'm incredibly proud of what the team does day in and day out, and how much focus and dedication goes into making that happen, where they really scrutinize every marketing dollar. We really focus on every sales call, doing the very best we can for our customers. And we found that if we work hard and we put out great product and we've got great people and we refine good processes, we end up having a lot of success. And and at the same time, I think we're all very cognizant of all the things we wish we had done better. I think that's one of the challenges of folks with a high, a very decisive mindset is oftentimes what we could have done better stands out. So we try to stop and make sure we smell the roses and celebrate these successes, because in some degrees we're running so fast. We're being honored by the local Chamber of Commerce for our growth. And I was joking with Greg that we got to be careful. If we keep going to all these galas, we're not going to have time to actually keep growing. But since it sounds like they're going to bring us up on stage, I guess we better go to that gala and put on our ties and,
right.
Drink some cocktails with some fine folks. But we're just going to keep doing what we're doing. We're going to keep making more whiskey. We're going to fill up the plant. We're going to keep hiring great salespeople. We're going to grow our marketing team, keep sharing the message. Even after 10 years, I'm pretty sure only about 7% of Rochester has come on a tour. And now we've got a whole new place to show them, where only about 100 of them have been on a tour. So, and in time, I'm hoping that whiskey tourism comes to New York the way it has come to the Kentucky Bourbon Trail, and will people come up from New York City and have a weekend in the Finger Lakes and make Rochester and our distillery one of their stops, and hopefully buy some bottles and take it home and share it with friends and talk about this great agricultural opportunity we have in upstate, and then hopefully find our bottles in their local bottle shop and keep drinking Black Button as part of that memory and part of wanting to support their local economy. I mean, you can't outsource locally made jobs. When we want to make more whiskey, we have to hire more New Yorkers. When we want to, malt more New York barley, we've got to pay more New York farmers. When we want to buy more New York barrels, they've got to have more New York loggers. And I'm not against globalization and free trade, but it's awfully nice being able to drive down the thruway and shake hands with the people we're doing business with and really get into the details of what makes that barrel great, what makes that grain great, what makes this the best scenario for them. Because as we are open and honest and communicate with folks, we end up finding great opportunities that are good for them and good for us. And that's kind of the same reason we like having so much local sales, is you can go and partner with folks pretty easily.
Yeah, and I think, from a brand messaging standpoint, that Inc. 5000 recognition is great earned messaging. We spend a lot of time creating the message, telling the story, and putting our perspective out. This is a third party saying, hey, you guys are all right. And, that's a message we can put out there. And locally, it resonates with a lot of folks to say, wow, look at this, hometown proud. This is a recognition that came from outside, and this is a Rochester company doing well. An economy where that's not always happening. You don't hear a lot of great messaging about business growing. That gives a lot of people reason to be proud and support us. And also, the farther we get from home, that's also another point where people from the outside can hear about Black Button and say, oh, somebody in Albany or downstate may start to recognize us a little bit more than they may have. So, we love to get that kind of messaging, and it all helps.
And I mean, granted, I only took one business course in college, so don't rely on me for this exactly, but thinking back, I'm pretty sure this would qualify kind of like phase 2 of a 3-phase business. At this point, you're going through the exponential growth. You're on definitely the upward trajectory on the graph. Now, 900% in 3 years, that's as exponential as you can get. Pretty
Just
much.
about.
Just about.
Right.
I'm not sure I even recommend it, actually.
Yeah. But from between the production and what we've been saying just while we're recording, it sounds like that maybe not 900%, but the exponential phase is still going to go on for another couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, we're just about to kick off our 2024 planning, and after that, we're going to do a new strategic 5-year plan. And most of but scratching it out on the back of the napkin, there's really no reason we don't expect to be a $100 million company in 5 years. One of the things that was actually holding our growth back was the limitations of our previous facility, both physically being able to make the product, but also just having people in different buildings and having to truck stuff around the city just complicated a lot of it. And now having everything back in one house really streamlines that communication, streamlines the ability to get things done. And I have no reason to believe that in 5 years we won't be a $100 million company. And that is a very strange thing for a kid who was sleeping on a futon working with me, myself, and I just 11 years ago. I mean, we have 147 staff members. We're getting to the point where we actually have to get an enterprise level payroll system. That's just not something I was expecting. And and now that we have big conversations about profit sharing 401k and health insurance and all these things that we just weren't able to provide in the early years, and that nobody really walks you through how to pick out a healthcare plan for your company. And when we got the first one, when we had 11 employees, we only could have 3 options. Now with over 100, we have lots of options, and so therefore the employees can kind of pick for themselves what works well. But yeah, I mean, each year we make our plan, we do our best to achieve or exceed that plan. At the end of the year, we sit down, see how that money should be reinvested, and do it all over again.
And is there room to grow further at this site if your next 10 years come around and you're needing to go past the 14,000?
So the facility is built to have 3 phases of it. That's what takes us from the 4,000 to the 14,000 barrels. And then we store barrels off-site, partly that they need different conditions and partly that you want really cheap rent.
Sure.
So where our new barrel warehouse campus has the ability to hold 10 barrel warehouses. So eventually that would be 300,000 square feet or 150,000 barrels of bourbon. If we get to that point, there is lots of land around Rochester. We will find a second campus. I don't know that beyond 14,000 barrels has much interest to me. We picked this size very intentionally in that it felt that it was a size we could achieve while also being able to achieve the great quality that we believe goes into every barrel, where you still are touching every barrel, doing it one barrel at a time. And maybe 10 years from now I'll feel different, but at least at the moment it is hard to imagine getting bigger than that. Now that doesn't mean we couldn't put up a second plant that maybe just did the contract work. There's lots of options, and I've learned that trying to be too far, it is good to think of the future and plan for the future, but also, since we don't know what the future holds, I don't know if we need to be 10 times this size or if we will struggle to fill this, because the future has yet to reveal itself to me. But at least for me, again, 14,000 barrels a year, that's 1 out of every 10,000 barrels of bourbon made on the planet. Maybe we don't have to get bigger than that. Because I would never want to sacrifice the quality and the commitment we have to our employees. It's important to me that I know, each of their names and what's going on in their family, and have the time to talk through when they're moving from one house to another or what's going on in their personal lives. And at some point, that's very hard to do as you continue to scale and scale, or maybe I'll get better at it, I don't know. But at least at the moment, I'm thinking 14,000 barrels is enough. Now, also, this is a hard time to ask me because I've just lived through the trauma of moving this.
Sure.
So maybe 5 years from now, I'll have forgotten and be ready to go. Also, if the last plant is any indication, as we live in it more and more, wouldn't surprise me if we can make 20 or 25,000 out of this place. As we get a little better at each of the pieces.
Fair enough. And Greg, from a marketing standpoint, what does that look like for you?
Well, certainly it's responding to the market. There's a lot of different variables to this. We look at certainly the distribution market, and we have fewer products that are out there than we do here in the tasting room. So we're really almost marketing two different kind of companies. As we're looking at maintaining and growing our core brands, what does that look like here in Rochester versus Albany? Even though we're in New York State, we have to have a different approach. It's really supporting and working really, really closely with our sales team. We can do a lot of things internally and say, hey, we want to go this direction with a new product or focus on a given product, but we really kind of have to respond to what's happening in the market and how our sales team is retail. Retailers are their own business. Mm-hmm. So as much as we may want to push something, we kind of have to go with what their customer base is. So, just from that standpoint, it's just, it's working with the market, working with what's happening in the reality of sales. The messaging is just continuing to change that messaging or maintain it depending on where we're going. Sure. I think we've been doing a good job of refining our brand messaging, keeping consistency. You want to be the same person. You don't want to come up with the same clothes all the time, but maybe get a new pair of shoes. Sure. So it's just staying on our toes with that. But I think innovation and product is another thing that here internally in this space, a lot different than our distribution business. We're trying to keep ourselves interesting to our consumers that are coming to visit us here. One, just from the cocktail and bar standpoint, but what do you have new? And I think we're all in the craft beverage industry kind of victims of our own success because we've innovated and come out with so many new things. Mm-hmm. Now everybody expects that. So, okay, now we have to keep filling that pipeline because everybody's looking for the next thing. Mm-hmm. So we can do that so far, but we have to do it within strategy.
And that brings us to the last group of questions, which is about your new products, experimentation, and what you released around the 10th anniversary. And before I forget, what is the actual anniversary date? Because I think I have it marked as December somewhere, but it was also celebrated in June.
So June 6th is the day I filed the paperwork for the company. And so that's historically the anniversary or birthday that we celebrate.
Gotcha.
We started making, because you end up with a lot of these. Like we made whiskey, or we made vodka for the first time in October. We made whiskey for the first time in February. We opened to the public for one day in December. So I could probably come up with 15 anniversaries around the year.
Opening here, July 15th. There's a new anniversary.
There we go. But filing the corporate papers, June 6th, 2012. Was the one we've historically celebrated.
Gotcha. So you just celebrated the 10th anniversary then, so congratulations to the entire team. It's a month before, as you noted, a month before you're opening the new facility, so it's been quite a summer so far. And in terms of, there were a couple of products that came out around the 10th anniversary, including what I believe is your oldest bourbon, your oldest aged stated whiskey to date.
Yep. Yeah, so luckily 7 years and 50 weeks before our 10-year anniversary. It was very unfortunate that we hadn't laid them down 2 weeks earlier. They would have been 8 years old, but technically I think they were 7 years and 50 weeks. We had put down 2 53-gallon barrels. They were put down in independent stave casks with a char 1, which is the lightest char. They sat in the back of warehouse number 1, which was a cinder block warehouse, so fairly moderate temperature swings. And it really took quite a while for these barrels to come to their own, come into their own. They're one of only about 6 barrels in the facility left that were made prior to Jeff Fairbrother, our master distiller, joining us. And so a few weeks, we were expecting that they would be ready. We pulled them a few weeks before the event, and we happened to work with a local organ shop that makes church organs all across the country, and they made these beautiful wooden hanging display cases for us. This summer also marked 100 years of my family being involved in the button business. So folks will see there's 2 anniversaries being celebrated in that box. And it just was, a really cool set of whiskey to bring to market in a beautiful package. The team did a great job with a black on black print, screen print. So we really kind of went all out for this, wanting the outside of the package to reflect the quality of the juice inside the package. And, it is a big, bold bourbon that has seen a lot and seen us through all these years, and it's been very well received by the public.
It's fantastic.
Yeah, it's always fun in the marketing standpoint too, because we can certainly suggest some things that we'd like to see, but a lot of things are happening in the back, and a lot of things have been happening over time. Jason will come out from time to time and say, "Oh, hey, look, what do we want to do with this? Here's a new exciting opportunity." So there's always something popping up that gives us some fun to play with.
And
as I say, and there's quite a few things in the warehouse that we're just waiting to see how they turn out. I mean, that's one of the challenges with experimentation is you lay these barrels down and they might take 3 years, they might take 5 years, they might never taste good, which means you do have to be very judicious about planning your experimentation. But also, marketing often finds out once it's ready and is like, hey, wait, I didn't know we had that. Well, we've got a lot of things.
Right.
But we go through our experimentals from time to time, and the ones that are deemed ready come to market, and the ones that don't, time does tend to heal most wounds, or we just aren't willing to admit that one went wrong.
Fair enough. And I mean, I've heard a couple of the experimentations that you guys have done. Some are on the shelf, so they're not, what's the word I'm looking for? Wow, just went right out of my head. They're not whispers. There we go.
Yeah.
But they're actually on the shelf. So we have the port finish, tequila barrel finish, and I don't know about the port, but for the tequila barrel finish, not an insignificant amount of time in those tequila barrels.
So all of our reserve series, the apple brandy finish, the port finish, the tequila finish, we tend to do several years in those secondary barrels. I think secondary finishing has so much great potential for our industry, but I like it, like for the port, it's black as night, deep, rich stone fruit. And if you're going to ask people for this kind of money, you've got to deliver a product that really knocks their socks off. And at the same time, if you're going to make a product that really knocks people's socks off, you've got to ask them for the money that makes it worth the investment of doing that. So, the port, for instance, we lose 57% of the whiskey due to evaporation. But it was 4-year-old whiskey that then does anywhere from 2 to 4 more in a port cask. And we only have a few of those casks, and we are always babying them and moving them around so that they get the optimal spots in the warehouse for where we're trying to drive them. And we usually only release 1 barrel a year. And for a while we were making 2 barrels a year. My guys did point out that someday that math wouldn't work. But these are the creative parts. It's the chef's table. It's what the owner wants to put down if time and money were not the sole objectives. And you can only play so much with that if you're, because otherwise you would run out of time and money.
True. But, well, and that creative spirit too. It's the chef's table. It's the distiller's table. It's some of the things that we've been doing. Our experimental series. These are just labeled as experimental series and by number, and we'll have very, very limited releases. This one was actually our most recent, and it was it's a 30% smoked corn in the mash bill, which just is a totally different type of bourbon. And these are the things that it allows our distillers to have a little bit of fun and experiment. And I think the idea is if something really hits, hey, now we have a product that we can bring to the broader market. Some of the things like this, the smoked corn, maybe not so much, but it's a great thing for our consumers to come in and just try something that they really, really haven't had before. Mm-hmm. And we're doing very limited batches, so they come and go. So we'll see more of these that will come out from time to time. I couldn't even tell you what they're going to be because they're still behind the curtain being made. And as Jason was saying, it's testing, tasting, and okay, we have something that's ready to come out. So we'll have a number of those things that are coming out. In our gins, we have one of our distillers doing a special holiday gin. It's going to be a one-off hit just for the holidays. Solstice Gin is the name. It'll have a little bit more of the features you'd expect from that season, a little bit more pine and cranberry, something that makes a great gift, but also something that customers are going to be really interested to try because it's that time of year. Kind of like the pumpkin beer thing. We want it to go away after that so we're not sitting on it too long. So sure. It gives us a lot of fun to talk about different products in short periods of time. Allows the staff the distilling team to experiment and have some fun and just kind of crack their knuckles other than what we're doing every day. So there's a lot of fun innovating.
And in addition to the finish you just mentioned, I mean, if I overheard correctly, and Alex can correct me if I misstated on these, but at a couple of different wood spirals as well, experimenting and with yellow birch, white ash. I mean, these are not woods that I have heard of being used before. Maybe they have, but I certainly haven't heard of them.
I was going to say, I can't name anyone else that has either. We do tend to be very interested in the cutting edge of our industry. The white ash is probably the most interesting because it manages to get the smoky, sweet marshmallowiness of like a s'more made over, a campfire right in the whiskey without being cloyingly sweet. And then the yellow birch has much more of, really accentuates the grain that was in that whiskey. So these are just our normal bourbon, 4-grain bourbon that have now had these woods in them for an extra 6-8 months. Really developed this unique flavor, only a couple barrels. So again, they'll probably go out as experimentals. And we may even start to blend some of those together. If you take cherry wood and apple wood and plum wood, you get really interesting notes from those fruits without it being Jolly Rancher style. And for us, the goal is always to have that be subtle. We don't want to smack you in the face with a white ash tree. We want you to know it's there and be able to recognize it, but also still know that it's great quality bourbon underneath. And so these are, some of the experiments we work on, and the challenging part of the experiments is they don't all work out. And so then what do you do with a barrel that went rogue, that, didn't develop the way you wanted it to? We have a variety of different ideas on that. Usually we try not to pour it out. Because also, you never know what time can do with it. A barrel, if a barrel, let's say, was overly cherry and we thought it was too much, we would probably end up transferring that whiskey out of that barrel, removing those cherry staves, putting it in a different barrel, particularly one that maybe had been a single barrel, and letting some of that cherry mellow over time. And you'd be surprised, sometimes 2, 3, 4 years later, something that was not good becomes very good. And if not, it takes up a spot in the rack house and eventually evaporates. Can't win them all.
Yeah.
Right. Well, as a bourbon drinker, I'm always fascinated by this because I'm not the science guy, and I hear this stuff, and I start drooling over some of these things. This is going to be great to try. The challenges come when we plan out the entire year. So as Alex and I will map out the schedule, and here's all of our releases, and then we're planning our social media and our marketing campaigns behind all of these releases. We know what the year is going to look like. Doesn't always go that way. You know, there may be some of these things like that didn't work so well. It's not going to happen. You got to do something else. Or hey, 3 months down the road, it actually turned out better. Now we can release this. And there's a little bit of a choreography. And when we do release things and all of our marketing messaging, we have things that get in the way, like holidays, things that are standard for us, like Lilac Gin that always comes out for Lilac Festival, which is in May. So we really need to have a pretty tight schedule. But there's always some of these pleasant surprises that pop up that we have to play with.
And of course, you get the joy of, if you have the triple wood, you were talking about the apple wood, the plum wood in there as well, you got a challenge working on those labels to make sure you communicate that.
Sure.
Not only you've got the bourbon, the information about the bourbon, but also the additional staves on there. And
yep. Right. Well, formulations, do we have to work with the TTV to get a formulation and the turnaround times? And now we may be looking at a government shutdown. That process, luckily we're in a good spot. We got everything out of the way before that was a real threat. But there's a lot of steps. I mean, we look at it, it probably takes about 6 months to incubate a brand if we're going to get it from the time that we conceive it to the time that it goes out. And if we've done it in shorter periods of time, if something has come up that we really got to get this out. But if you're doing it right, you really got to hit all the steps in the logical order.
And unfortunately, as much as we'd like this to be the case, the TTV is not an essential service.
Yeah, right.
We'd like it to be, but
the tax enforcement part of it is.
That is, yeah,
right.
Very true.
Right, and then we have the SLA, the New York SLA. So there's a lot of steps. I mean, it's but we've got a pretty good process. So and I think we're on it, and it's just a matter of all of us following it and hitting our dates.
Oh, fantastic. Well, with that, I'm going to end by saying there are several products that hopefully I'm going to, purchase, take home with me, and share with some friends, and some which are available through distribution, some which are only available here, and hopefully that'll encourage people to come up to Rochester to visit, to meet you guys, talk about the spirits, and really enjoy them and explore them. And in the meantime, Jason, thank you for coming back on. Greg, thank you for joining. Alex, thank you for helping to set this up. I just want to shout out to also Allison on the team for helping to get me up here. It was a real pleasure to visit. Honestly, I think it's my first time in Rochester. I may have been here when I was very young, but I don't remember, so I'll hedge my bets on that one. But
we appreciate having you.
Yeah, it won't be the last time. So
well,
I look forward to
meeting
coming
you,
back.
and thanks for coming up.
Absolutely. Well, thank you guys. This has been a very special episode. Really appreciate it. Also, this will have been announced already, but Black Button is now a sponsor of the Whiskey Ring podcast, and couldn't be happier to have you guys on, and look forward to spreading the gospel of Black Button and also of New York whiskey writ large.
Amen.
It's been another episode of the Whiskey Ring podcast. Thanks everyone for listening. Keep your eyes on the show notes and other news for releases, and I will see you all next week. Hey folks, thanks for listening to another episode of the Whiskey Ring podcast. If you like what you hear, please go ahead and click that subscribe, follow, or like button. Leave a rating and review on your podcast app of choice, and let me know what you want to hear. You can reach out to me through the podcast apps or email me at david@whiskeymyweddingring.com with any suggestions or ideas for new show guests. You can also support the podcast at patreon.com/whiskeymyweddingring. That's whiskey with an E, for as little as $1 a month. $5 a month gets you access to bonus content, including our soon-to-resume Under the Influencer series, and $25 a month means you join the Barrel Share Club. Each month, Barrel Share Club members get to try products sent to me for review, bottles from my own collection, and sometimes bottles that I just pick up because they're fun or interesting. Right now, only 5 spots remain in the Barrel Share Club, so grab your place today. Finally, please follow on Instagram. You can follow me at Whiskey My Wedding Ring or at Whiskey Ring Podcast. You can follow me on Twitter at Whiskey Ring. You can follow on Facebook at Whiskey My Wedding Ring or join the Facebook group, the Whiskey Ringers Group. And I hope to see you there. Cheers, thank you for the support, and see you next time.